That's rather striking because in the past, until Theresa May happened, as it were, foreign students of every nationality were allowed a 2-year work permit in the UK after completing a course at a British university. But those restrictions came in. Indian students have been finding it difficult even to get internships or part-time work while they study in the UK. And then in 2013, Theresa May tried to introduce a controversial visa bond scheme for just people from 6 countries named, of which India was, of course, the most prominent and the largest. And the purpose of the visa bond scheme was to prevent high-risk students, her words, high-risk students, staying on in the UK after their work permits expired. Now, there was obviously an outcry, not just from here, but from a number of British liberals, and the scheme was eventually scrapped by David Cameron, who was still Prime Minister. But of course, it caused widespread outrage amongst both Indian students there and prospective Indian students, and it did lead to a sharp fall in applications for student visa to the UK. Now, linked to this attitude towards the most populous Commonwealth country is a broader challenge, and I'm going to be fairly blunt here, relating to the kinds of forces that were unleashed in the course of Brexit. It's interesting, for example, hate crimes in the UK in 2015 to 16, this is before the Brexit vote, were already up 19% on the previous year. And I think one can certainly ascribe this to a great extent to the climate of intolerance of foreigners that was whipped up in the course of the Brexit campaign. The proof of this is in the first 4 days after the referendum result, there was an increase of 57% in hate crimes in the UK. Now, I mention this simply to say that if you're looking at, through rose-tinted spectacles of the prospect of improving relations with the Commonwealth countries, Britain will have to come to terms with the fact that, with the exception of a handful of Commonwealth countries, the rest of them are inconveniently brown or black, and therefore quite visibly different from the majority population of the UK. If they're going to be subject to a country that is getting more bigoted, more intolerant, and more willing to unleash hate crimes upon their visible minorities, I think there would be a serious challenge to overcome before we can speak very optimistically about improved opportunities for Commonwealth relations as a result of Brexit. I mean, I certainly believe it's as much in Britain's interest to attract Indian students as it is in India's interest for our students to study there. The Indian government should therefore, I think, have to ask, why this is happening, whether there's a withdrawal of the welcome mat by Home Secretary Theresa May, which may reflect a broader attitude by Prime Minister Theresa May, and this is something that it's entirely legitimate for the Indian political establishment to bear in mind. Now, I don't particularly want to see Indian students going off to England for very long, because my hope and expectation is that most of these students should and will return to India with enhanced skills and knowledge and training, whereas emigrants are lost to India altogether. So there's no reason to encourage permanent departure, and Britain should be reassured on that score. But at the same time, obviously, one of the attractions is to gain a couple of years of work experience, which is valuable in terms of training, and at the same time give them a certain nest egg or cushion of savings when they come back to India. And so the thing that I think India will need, and many other members of the non-white Commonwealth will need, is an assurance that these increasing tendencies of anti-immigration policies and hostility to immigrants and minorities signify a sort of level of unwelcome, which could have broader implications for the question before us today of the Commonwealth offering an alternative to Brexit. Now, on that, I don't want to end on a negative note, and so I'm going to end on what the more positive case is. There is obviously, for example, with the end of the EU agreement, and since all signs coming out of the EU are that there will be a hard Brexit and not the soft one that many in the ruling party in Britain might have hoped for, that Britain will have to look for alternatives to its now very comfortable membership in the EU common market. And if that is so, then obviously a ready-made alternative would appear to be the prospects of negotiating a Commonwealth free trade area, which would be a significant and indeed a larger and more significant alternative to an EU free trade area. But that would require, as I said, some things to change. However, there's a number of positive things about it, and none better articulated recently than by Lord Howell in an article in the Telegraph, when he said that while the EU is a mixture of supranational tendencies and intergovernmental cooperation, and I quote here, today's Commonwealth draws its strength from the extraordinary connectivity at countless non-governmental levels, including flourishing business and professional links, which a common working language, common legal procedures, common accounting and commercial practices, and common cultural links both allows and reinforces, unquote. And I think he's quite right there. I mean, certainly Indian chartered accountants and indeed Indian certified cost accountants are essentially learning skills that are identical to those being taught and applied in Britain. Our legal systems obviously have evolved in many ways, but still are joined at the hip, to use Kamalesh's phrase, and have a lot of prior common origins. The cultural links, no better exemplified than the current ongoing test series, in which Britain is assuming its rightful place as the loser in the contest. All of this suggests, I think, to some degree, that there is a lot knitting the two together that could be built upon. And I can quote Lord Howell once more, and he said that what has emerged in the modern Commonwealth network is not an old-style trading bloc, but something much more novel and suited to the network age, he says, a grassroots-driven type of organization. He said this is proving more suitable to the expansion of trade and commerce in the digital age, with its growing emphasis on information and data exchange, than the more dated EU hierarchy with its heavy and top-down bias towards centralization, scale, and integration. And that's perhaps a more debatable point of view than his first one, but it's worth putting out there as, if you like, an optimistic argument for strengthening Commonwealth links in the wake of Brexit. There is also a report from the Commonwealth Secretariat which has pointed out that Commonwealth trade and investment flows of all kinds are now growing noticeably faster than overall world trends. Intra-Commonwealth trade now accounts for about 15% of total world exports. And the Commonwealth Secretariat, and of course they would, wouldn't they? But still, they argue that there is something called a Commonwealth advantage, which they say is up to 20%, which is what they translate as the practical economic value in both trading and investment interchanges of the existence of those things that Lord Howell talked about, shared language, shared systems, etc., between Commonwealth members, rather than those compared to non-Commonwealth countries. So if there is a Commonwealth advantage, if trade therefore has an obvious platform that can be built upon, then the best possible outcome for both Britain and the Commonwealth countries out of Brexit would be moving rapidly to negotiations on a Commonwealth free trade area that would certainly compensate then for the loss to Britain of its membership in the European Common Market and the loss to the Commonwealth countries of having a partner that was itself a member of the EU. So that perhaps is the most optimistic note on which I would like to conclude. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Tharoor. I can't help but say that, I mean, this was fascinating remarks, but help but say that there is growing concern in the loser that the playing field between the two teams is not level. May I request Mr. Sunanda Datta-Ray, author, columnist, and former editor of the Statesman, for his 15-minute remarks. Thank you very much.
I'm surprised, ladies and gentlemen, that both Shashi Tharoor and James Mayall invoked Talleyrand without mentioning what, to my mind, is his most famous remark, and that is that speech was given to man to conceal his thoughts. I hope it doesn't apply to the two speakers, but perhaps Talleyrand picked that up from his wife, who, some of you may know, was a girl from Bengal, The Princess Talleyrand was known as Madame Legrand. She was born and brought up in Chandernagore outside Calcutta, the old French colony. And the rail that James Mayall mentioned in the Travellers Club, on which in my decrepit old age I also have to lean, was really installed not because Talleyrand was old, but because he was crippled. And I'm not crippled, but I still need to clutch at that rail while climbing the stairs to the dining room. Now, I agree entirely with what Shashi Tharoor said about the human aspect of Brexit. And I'll come to that at various points in my few minutes. Many of you will know that Disraeli famously said that if Gladstone fell into the Thames, it would be a misfortune, and if he was fished out, it would be a calamity. If Britain leaves the European Union, it will be a misfortune for us, admittedly. But if Britain closes its doors to Indians, then it will be a calamity. And this is something in which governments and people are not in full consonance. The government might think of trade deals. Sajjad Javed was here talking to Nirmala Sitharaman the other day. But at the popular level, it's not trade, it's migration. And what Kamalesh Sharma, bless his soul, left out of saying is that before the 1949 London Declaration was announced, Jawaharlal Nehru tried very hard for a common passport between Great Britain and India. Why did he try for a common passport? Because that is the popular aspiration of this country. It was refused by Britain. In turn, he refused something, actually wrote to him to suggest a title from India's heroic age, Clement Attlee's actual words, for King George VI. Well, Nehru probably had great pleasure refusing that too. We are linked with Britain in many ways, and I've been wondering, watching the drama of Tata Sons and Tata Steel unfold, whether that's cause and effect of Britain's Brexit crisis, whether cause or effect. If you remember Cyrus Mistry, the ousted chief, was dead set on selling Britain's substantial steel assets, India's steel assets in Great Britain. He was toppled in a coup, and now not only is India not selling those assets, but India has promised a £1 billion investment fund in those companies. And one of those companies makes a phenomenal loss of £1 million a day. In addition, India is going to step up their retirement scheme, offer bonus opportunities. It's a bonanza for Theresa May. And what will we get in return? Theresa May will wear a sari the next time she visits. But that's passé. Sherry Blair did it years ago. Sarah Brown wore a salwar kameez. So there's no great credit in that, unless, of course, she can persuade Philip May to wear a dhoti instead. Theresa May, as Shashi rightly said, is more Home Secretary than Prime Minister. I must confess that though we go to England every year, I'd never heard of her until some years ago at Heathrow Airport, when my wife's fingerprint wouldn't register on the machine that we have to use. She, of course, said it was the slavery of the household and the kitchen that had wiped her fingers clean. But the immigration officer said his machine was defective, and he wouldn't have bothered. He would have let us through. He saw from our passport, we go every year, we have a base there. But he said, what will Theresa May say? She'll see there's one passenger not checked for fingerprint, and she'll say something and he'll get to the papers. We have to watch out for Theresa May. So that is Theresa May, and what will her visa regime be like? It's a question which has been answered. Shashi's given some examples of what it might be like, but we have to think of her visa regime if she is freed from all constraints. Now, this may not arise, Britain may not go into Brexit. I'm taking a legal view. I don't regard this as inevitable. The referendum was not a compelling thing. Whatever the politicians might say, it was not legally binding. David Cameron didn't have to resign. Theresa May doesn't have to invoke Article 50. Those are nowhere laid down. They are doing it because These are democratic obligations, not legal compulsions. And that is what Britain and India share, the sense of democracy. Now that can be, and the obligations that flow from it. And that can be a double-edged sword. In this country, we've seen that democracy can produce undemocratic results. A democracy can be used to abolish democracy. That's what happened in Europe in the past. In India, perhaps the possibility is remote because of something that some of you may know of, called the Kesavanand Bharati case of 1973, where the courts ruled that the basic features of the Constitution, going down to its fundamentals, could not be done away with, eliminated by brute majority in the House of the People. Thank heavens for the restraining power of the Rajya Sabha. But these are fears that remain, and they haven't been abolished. Now, what's not remembered often, just as the Kesavananda Bharati case is forgotten, so it's also forgotten that the question of an European identity was created in India. Long before Europeans thought of themselves as Europeans, we dubbed all whites in this country European, including Americans. When I joined the Statesman newspaper, the lunchroom was called the European tiffin room. And the food wasn't at all European. It wasn't even Indian. It was a watery mulligatawny soup. It was roast chicken and baked custard, day in and day out. And that was the European tiffin room. The toilet on my floor, I could see under the new varnish, Europeans only, had been painted out, but it was still there visible. We regarded, as I say, we foresaw the European Union, and we saw its extension into what Shashi called the oldest colony that Britain managed to lose. Because if Americans were also Europeans, well, why shouldn't the common market one day embrace them too? And that is despite Trump, Lafarge, and Le Pen. It's the human element of it. When Queen Victoria's Jubilee was being celebrated, there was much more coverage in the American press than in Britain, and which prompted the Times of London to invite the United States to rejoin the empire if they were so enthusiastic about the monarchy. Now, the Commonwealth. The Commonwealth has survived, and that's the best thing that can be said about it. I don't go as far as the late R.K. Karanjia of Blitz magazine, who used to ask repeatedly, where is the Commonwealth in the Commonwealth? Nor do I go as far as the late, much misunderstood Enoch Powell, who called it a gigantic farce. Malcolm Muggeridge, who used to be a journalist on my old paper, The Statesman, saw the Commonwealth as a holding company in which the Queen had the majority ownership of equity, but wasn't allowed a place on the board. And you may remember there have been occasions when African countries have threatened to expel Britain from the Commonwealth. But the Commonwealth exists, and that's all that can be said about it from a rational point of view. Irrationally, there are lots of its spheres of influence. For India, a major thing, which no one will say, no government official will ever say, is that it is the biggest grouping of countries where India is a member and China isn't. And that is a tremendous lobbying point for the government of India. And it also explains the office India has helped to set up in New York for the smaller countries of the Commonwealth who have very little funding and very little voice in public. It's the same with the United Nations. I remember once when our old friend Dawa Sering, who was the longest serving Prime Minister of any country, of Bhutan, was asked about the United Nations, and he said if the UN General Assembly didn't exist, the world would forget Bhutan. So that applies to a lot of the smaller countries of the Commonwealth, and that's why India is funding them. The Commonwealth will never die. The reason was, it's pity Kamalesh is gone, 1965, when Arnold Smith was appointed Secretary General, I happened to be in London, and an FCO man, Foreign Commonwealth Office man, said, you can rest assured the Commonwealth is safe now. Civil servants, we civil servants know how to look after ourselves, and we will ensure that the Commonwealth, the Marlborough House establishment, the staff, what was then a mere flat for Arnold Smith has now become a 3-story house in the most expensive part of Mayfair for the Secretary General. These are the appurtenances of the Commonwealth that gives its officials a vested interest in the institution, and they will continue it. Now, what we need to do as we face, or as Britain faces a crisis, I don't think it's such a crisis for India, unless it's made into a crisis, are to ensure the 3 props of any relationship are safeguarded: trade, investment, and migration, which Shashi touched on. As far as trade is concerned, it won't be difficult, I think, to work out an Indo-British arrangement. We need each other economically. We've lived together for so many years. All the advantages of the relationship that Professor Mayall and Shashi have talked of, they militate in favor of continuing the relationship. The European Union is a new body. We don't know each other so well. But there are individual Indian trade agreements with the Netherlands, with Germany, with a number of East European countries, and a way must be found to mesh them together into an overall free trade agreement. That there has been talked of for many years. I think there have been something like 15 or 16 rounds, but none, surprisingly, since 2007. I believe the sticking point is that the EU wants duties on cars, spirits and wines to be either reduced or drastically lowered. Well, the EU probably doesn't know India. You know, when the Common Market, as it was called then, was first setting up an embassy in Delhi, they had the seminars and the debates in Calcutta. They had the panoply, the cocktail parties and the public receptions in Delhi, and they came to have their intellectual software in Calcutta. And the ambassador told me at the time that we were told this was the intellectual capital of India, so we have our seminars and discussions here. But we find that you in Calcutta know what the British were saying 10 years ago, and you haven't moved beyond that. But the EU hasn't been told of India's buying power. That consumerism here is almost rapacious. They think that without duty, with these high duties, European cars and wines and spirits won't be sold in India. Little do they know that a house can cost $2 billion, that the bill for a wedding can run up to 500 crores. The rich in this country don't hoard their money in 500 or 1,000 rupee notes. That's evident to anyone. Only the poor do, or the relatively poor do. In the bad old days of autarky, socialist autarky, which ended in 1990, there was no import of Scotch whisky. Yet the shops were full, the shop shelves were full, at least in Calcutta, and the official reason given was that this was old stock. It was unending old stock. It was like one of those labors of Hercules. But it didn't make any difference. This land of Gandhian austerity is lavish in its tastes. So if Europe and India can work out a free trade agreement based not on principles but on practice, then there will be no dearth of market, of purchasers for European goods. It will be like China flooding the market with cheap goods. They'll come in at the high end. Now, what we will sell them in return is a different matter. European investors must worry about retrospective taxes, remembering the cases of Vodafone and Cairns. They must worry about quality control. They must worry about intellectual property rights. They must worry about Indian manufacturers and exporters not cutting corners. These are all matters to be looked at. We come to the most emotive aspect, which has been dealt with some length by Shashi, the human element. I agree with his facts, but not with his conclusions, because a lot of these students, sadly to say, are not students at all. Like the specialist cooks that Britain at one time wanted to invite from the Commonwealth countries. And in Bangladesh, the British High Commission had mile-long queues from people who'd never touched a ladle in their lives. They didn't want to go to England to cook. They wanted, this was to save the curry industry in London. They wanted to go to Britain, period. And that is a failure on our part. India was the jewel in Britain's crown, and which Britain was loath to part with it. Now Britain is the jewel in India's crown that we are loath to part with.